So why don't we start by explaining what a screenwriter of a documentary does, especially a film like this where there's no scripted narration. What's your role in terms of putting it together?
I just also want to say I'm a sort of last-minute understudy for Sam Pollard, the director. I just happened to be at the Earth, Wind, and Fire concert down the block, and I got a text to come over. Sam unfortunately got delayed with a flight with another project he's doing, but I'm very, very happy to be here. It's an excellent question. Just sort of pull the camera back a little bit. I've worked with the executive producer of American Masters, Michael Cantor, now for, I don't know, a decade and a half. And we did a lot of different projects, including Broadway the American Musical, which was a 6-part series, Make 'Em Laugh, which is about the history of comedy, blah, blah, blah. And whatever project we did, we wound up having to cut Sammy Davis Jr. out. He became producer of American Masters, I want to say maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. And like literally 2 weeks to the day that he got the job, I called him at his office and I said, "How you doing?" "Fine." I said, "Do you have your pictures of your family on your desk?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Do you know where the copy machine is by now?" "Yes." "What are you asking me?" I said, "Well, it's been 2 weeks. Why don't we do Sammy Davis Jr.?" And this is the first project under his tenure that he initiated. So what does a screenwriter do? I've been a fan of Sammy all my life, and the first thing was to get a kind of shape for it and a proposal for it. We got $500,000 from the National Endowment for the Humanities to make this movie. A writer, in this particular case, the documentary identifies the people you want to get interviewed, writes the questions, does the research. And indeed, initially there was some narration, but when Sam came on the project, and he worked great work with his editor, Steve Weschler, it just sort of seemed, because they're very good at it, and B, because of the structure of it, which was pretty kind of hot-wired from the beginning, and C, most important, the fact that Sammy Davis Jr. was not a shy individual. This isn't a documentary about, J.D. Salinger. So there was a ton of stuff that, what are you going to say that he wasn't going to say better? So it was very helpful.
Yeah, it's really beautifully done. It's really seamless the way it's all told, and the voices of the people, of Sammy and the people who knew him.
Right.
It's really beautifully put together. So why are you such a fan of Sammy Davis? What makes him an American master?
Well, I'm taking a quick glance, of the people who came tonight. I'm a kid of the 60s, and I grew up in Long Island, and I remember watching Sammy, or he sort of came into my consciousness maybe when I was watching Laugh-In or Batman, where he was, one of those guys who came out the door with the Cape Crusader, or I Dream of Jeannie, and he was this ubiquitous, kind of baffling, somewhat of a buffoon in the 60s on TV. And he amused me, and because I loved Laugh-In and Batman, obviously. And then in our local library, we had a lot of cast albums, which was another love of mine, Broadway musicals, and there was this album called Golden Boy. And I got it when I was, 10, 11, 12, and brought it home, and that was the same guy. And I thought, how could that sort of be, So I was ultimately fascinated, and I remember, like it was yesterday, 1968, reading an issue of Man magazine, which is clearly one of the great cultural arbiters of the 20th century. And they did a spoof, it was always a spoof, but they did a piece, a section, called Racial Stereotypes by the Numbers. And it was like how people saw, how people saw different races from a racist point of view, right? Couldn't be more timely than that, right? And it was like, 1 Jew is a stand-up comic, 2 Jews are a tailor shop, 3 Jews are a folk singing group. And then it had a section on Negroes, which was the lingua franca back then in the 60s. And it was 1 Negro was someone who moves into your neighborhood, 2 Negroes was a prize fight, 3 Negroes was an emerging African nation, 4 Negroes was Sammy Davis Jr. And to this day, I remember it like it was yesterday, and I think more than anything that kind of informed my thought about this is he was one guy who had to be 4 times better than anyone else, and because of his race back then. And I just started listening to all his records and just found him an utterly fascinating, eternally engaging figure to watch and listen to.
Do you see his influence on later performers, or even current performers? I mean, it struck me that Michael Jackson,
Well,
performed at his tribute, and he also kind of wanted to be a post-racial figure, it seemed like Sammy.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things I think of Sammy, he's like a human Venn diagram. And who else worked with Ethel Waters and Michael Jackson? Who else worked with Archie Bunker and Martin Luther King? Who else dealt with Eddie Cantor and Clifford Odets and Richard? I mean, he just was the bandwidth of 20th century showbiz. It's interesting, people have tried to do a screen biopic or a stage biopic of him. It's not possible because you really do need 4 people to be Sammy Davis. And it's remarkable to have this footage of Michael Jackson because everything that you start with, it seems to me, in the Sammy Davis story, being a young kid, a great dancer at a young age, exploited by your family, trying to make the transition, Michael Jackson's story is a kind of a shadow story of Sammy's. They were quite close. Michael used to come over to Sammy's house and ask for advice. There's some wonderful footage we didn't get to include. I want to say 85, 86, Sammy went on tour and would imitate Michael and he did the moonwalking better than Michael could. It's quite extraordinary. Obviously Greg Hines, I mean, there are a million people who were influenced by Sammy.
Yeah. His political evolution is really fascinating too, and it made me think of Kanye West endorsing Donald Trump too.
Absolutely.
Do you think that his embracing of Nixon had anything to do with the fact that JFK had shunned him?
I think it had everything to do with that. I mean, I think it's very perceptive. I mean, the Kennedy administration, shut everything down, and there's a voice of some private tapes he made that we found that said, essentially, nothing hurt me worse than that. It wasn't that I was disinvited because of my political views. I was disinvited as an entertainer, and that really, to the end of his days, I think that influenced him. And the respect, for whatever motivation, that Nixon conferred upon him was substantial and extremely influential to him. Yeah.
And why do you think he was seen as a more polarizing figure than Harry Belafonte, who was also very political and married to a white woman and really talented?
I mean that's fascinating. I think some of it, frankly, probably had to do with his the darkness of his skin color vis-a-vis Harry Belafonte. I think it was a sense of him being such a public, slightly outrageous figure. He did not, as he said, I don't want to be the boy next door. He did not blend in to the shadows very well. So I think he was, and he also walked in having these very public relationships with white actresses and stuff. So I think it's an incredible shame. I believe, I don't know, it's not exactly clear who made the phone call, but we think it was brother in Lawford, as Frank Sinatra called Peter Lawford, who had to make the phone call to Sammy to disinvite him from the inauguration.
And one thing I didn't realize before I saw the film was the degree of the lack of education that he really had, had no schooling whatsoever, that he really read at such a low level. How much of that do you think contributed to his sense of self-worth or his desire for acceptance?
I don't think as much as the fact that this family, or these 3 guys, probably spent more time sleeping in railway station benches than in, under a coverlet and stuff like that. I think it was such a transient existence. He's not the only showbiz person, black, white, brown, Jewish, whatever, who felt alienated and disaffected because they were in show business. So I think there was a large part of that. Shakespeare has a line where he says, "Sweet are the uses of adversity." And one of the ironies is, which also we didn't quite get to, is no, he didn't go to school, but because they were on the road in the 30s and 40s, his dad sort of said, here's a nickel, go watch as many movies as you want. And his education was the movies, and Bogart and Cagney. He loved, which we didn't quite get, Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. Late in life, he developed this fanboy relationship with Christopher Lee, the British horror film actor. He adored him, and Christopher Lee would come over to his house at night and jump through the window and scare the crap out of him, and he loved it. And so he was a fanboy. He's what we would call a fanboy now.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but his family didn't really participate in the making of this documentary. I know there's some archival.
Yes and no.
Interviews.
Sammy had a very complicated family life, as you can imagine. When he died, he owed more money to the IRS than any individual in American history up to that point. And his
Even Willie Nelson. Wow, that's
Pardon?
Even Willie Nelson.
Well, I
that's a
mean,
lot.
when he died, I'm saying at that point,
Yeah,
maybe Willie Nelson, Red Fox, or lots of people, I'm sure
Right.
people we don't know, who owned a ton of money. And he had 2 children with my Brit, who you saw, Tracy and Mark, adopted a 3rd child, and then late in life, he and essentially his 3rd wife, third wife, depends how you look at it, Altavis adopted a kid in the early 80s named Manny Davis. And it took Michael Cantor, the executive producer, I would say the better part of 8 months, simply trying to figure out who owned stuff. And Manny was the last sort of heir standing who was the least been interested. And we said, we do this, and your dad, and he said, oh yeah, well, my dad had 2 storage lockers in Burbank that haven't been opened in 30 years. So we made a deal that we would digitize all of his stuff in exchange for a fee. So all the stuff you see in this documentary, I would say 40% of it has never been seen before because we had access to his stuff.
Yeah. He was also a very physically small man. I mean, there are the gags where Dean picks him up, and he seems to get smaller and smaller as he ages. That last clip of him, he's almost disappearing before our eyes. How do you think that affected him psychologically? Do you think that was also a factor in his kind of wanting to prove himself?
I would leave that to psychologists. Did he have a Napoleon complex in that regard? I think, again, I think it's one of the lines we open up the doc with, I'm black, I'm Jewish, Puerto Rican, I have one eye. When I move into a neighborhood, I wipe it out, right? So I think he was under no illusions, right? I mean, he knew what he looked like in the mirror every morning or every afternoon when he got up, and he managed to kind of internalize that and not give a shit, frankly, and just sort of said, this is who I am, and if you're better at what I do than I am, go ahead, but I probably don't think you are. So.
Do you think he was ever hurt by any of the jokes that they made about him on stage, or do you think he just thought it was part of the act and the guys really loved each other?
As you can see, I think Sam did really well. There's lots of schools of thought about how he was treated by the Rat Pack. Was he a junior partner? Did he actually like them? He certainly adored Frank Sinatra, and Frank was the biggest in everything that Frank did. Sammy wanted to do, except for one thing he did, which Frank never did, which we'll talk about maybe. But I think that it was a different time, and especially in the times with this week, for Pete's sake, racism in entertainment is a very potent force. So it's interesting to look at it from a 2018 perspective, from a 1963 perspective. Was it different? I mean, we think of the Rat Pack and those as like this kind of long-running event. They only did a few concerts. We're lucky to have the footage we have. But you can see a definite difference if you assiduously watch Rat Pack footage from 59 to 63. He definitely, is kind of now cut that out after a while. So it's hard to say.
So what was the one thing he did that Frank Sinatra never did?
What I find fascinating is, Judy Garland, Bing Crosby, Dinah Shore, Tony Bennett. Did I say Frank Sinatra?
Yep.
Frank Sinatra. They all were major, and Sammy, major pop singers of the 20th century. But only Sammy did a Broadway show, right? And he actually did 3. There's an earlier one called Mr. Wonderful that we cut because we thought it was sort of diminishing the Golden Boy sequence, and late in life he did a revival of Stop the World. That means you're performing 8 shows a week. And did anybody here see Golden Boy when it was running? No? So he sang 8 songs. Yes? Yeah? He did 8 songs in that show and a prize fight at the end. And he did that show in New York, Chicago, and London for 3.5 years. So he was like, hey, to go on Broadway and be a leading man in a Broadway show, a serious Broadway show, sign me up. And I think that's extraordinary.
And why do you think he never stopped smoking and drinking and chose not to have surgery? I mean, do you think he was ready to give up at that point?
I think he was an indulgent human being. I think he lived somewhat Dracula-like, you know, in the night outs where he came alive at 3 in the morning, you know, with a bottle of bourbon and a suite in Vegas, entertaining a whole, you know, coterie of people. And I think he thought he could probably cheat death. And I think, as Billy Crystal says, better than I ever could, he just thought, you know, if I lost my voice, if I was like poor Jack Klugman, who, you know, had probably had throat cancer and had to learn how to speak again, what's the point of being around?
And his publicist says something toward the end of the film about he only felt safe on stage. Why do you think that is? Is it because he grew up there, he didn't know anything else? Or?
Yeah, I think that's, for my money, that's maybe, I don't know, 80% a little over-sentimentalized. I think that what he knew was he could connect with 50, 100, 1,000 people at a time. And he knew he was good at it. I remember, I don't know if this is germane, you'll tell me if it is or not. I dated an actress at one point, and we broke up. And I remember saying to her, you know what your problem is? You only care about 1,000 people loving you for one night. You don't care about one person loving you for 1,000. And I thought that was a good line at the time.
It's very dramatic.
Didn't do any good. But I think that it's, you know, again, it's not unique among showbiz people. It's not unique. Michael Jackson, Sinatra, a million other people. That's what they did well, and that was the gratification of that was so immediate and so uncomplicated. Although his personal life was astonishingly complicated, when he got in front of a group of people at the Sands or at the Fontainebleau or the Copacabana or on Broadway or you name it, he knew what he was doing. And that's what he was trained to do his whole life. What was he going to do? Like quit and become an engineer? I mean, it made no sense. He tried everything. He was a terrible talk show host. He had a series that he produced called Sammy and Company. He was a terrible guest, I think. Those of you, in my opinion, those of you remember him from Carson, he was always slapping his thigh and laughing way too hard, and I don't think that helped his reputation, but he tried everything. And in a weird way, because Sinatra tried everything, with the exception of Sinatra made serious, did a television variety series, so did Sammy. Sinatra tried to be a serious film actor, so did Sammy, and on and on and on and on. So Sinatra kind of paved the way, and Sammy followed as best he could, being a black man in the 20th century.
Now I want to know who the actress is you dated, but I won't ask that because that would
I'll
be
tell you
impolite. Before we open up for questions from the audience, why do you think Sammy's story is still important today?
God, it's more important today. Is there anything more important than identity politics in the 21st century? I've got to be me. What is me? Am I a black man, a Jewish man, a singer? And who am I? And how does the world see me? I think that, I was just reading at this lovely French bistro down the block, an article in the Times today where I guess security advisor for Obama's as a manuscript of a book that's coming out. And the Times article focuses a lot on Obama's shock, really, at Hillary Clinton losing the election and having to realize the person who would follow in his footsteps would be Donald Trump. And he said, maybe I was 10 or 20 years too soon. And to me, the great story of Sammy Davis is he was a running back in a football game his whole life, and they kept moving the goalposts further and further away. He would run 80 yards, 70 yards, catch a thing, run, and he'd run, and all of a sudden he couldn't score the goal because, unbeknownst to him, society was moving that goalpost. And I can't think of a more pertinent story than that.
I think we have time for a few questions if anyone out there wants to wait for the microphone and raise their hand. I see one over there.
Hello. I don't know if you were lucky enough to ever see Sammy Davis Jr. And I saw him at the Copacabana like 50 years ago. And to this day, I've told my husband, I have never seen anybody more talented in my life, and I doubt I ever will. He was unbelievable. And every single thing that they said he did in spades. It was unbelievable. So, really
great. Lucky you.
Another question over here.
Yeah, why do you think his kids had nothing to do with this?
His kids were complicated. I don't think that it wasn't that they disowned this. I think that his daughter Tracy wrote 2 books about him. First book was how much he hated him, and the second book was how much he loved him. It's interesting. He had interesting. He obviously wrote this, as many of you know, this autobiography, Yes, I Can, which is actually in the lobby here, downstairs, among the great film books you guys have. And then he wrote a second book, not very good, called Why Me, I think it's called. But he was interviewed by this man, Bert Boyar, in countless hotel rooms in the mid-'80s. And we got access to some of those tapes. And at one point, he was talking about being on Broadway in Golden Boy. His wife and 2 kids had moved to New York to be with him. He would do the show at night. He would then go do a club date. He would then go film a television series. And he said, I feel terrible about it because all the kids want is for their dad to take them to the zoo. And he said, frankly, I'm not too excited about going to the fucking zoo. That was his quote. And you sort of got that. It's like he was so on so many pistons running as Sammy Davis Jr., he really didn't have time for his family. I don't doubt that he loved them in his way, but he was an entertainer 25 hours a day. And of course, not surprisingly, again, you know, fill in the blank, Betty Davis's kids, Joan Crawford's kids, Frank Sinatra's kids, a million of them, that was just led to a really deep estrangement. And when my Brit divorced him and moved to California, that was kind of it. They were pretty much a continent away, so he wasn't really very involved in their upbringing.
Another question?
Excellent picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was disappointed about the Kennedy incident and Sinatra not sticking up for him because, you know, popular culture was, you've read Sinatra was kind of loved him and, you know, was protective. Who was his protector? Who was his person, man or woman, that was like looking out for his interests?
I think 95% of the time it was Sinatra. And Sinatra helped integrate a lot of the casinos and clubs in Vegas. He always pushed for Sammy. He gave Sammy had a rather complicated recording contract life. Frank gave him a shot at Reprise Records, which was Sinatra's label. So Sinatra said at one point in the 80s, if you don't give up that coke, I'm never speaking to you again. And he didn't for about 6 years. They finally came together. They did a tour, Rat Pack tour in the mid 80s. So I guess Sinatra broke with him in the late 70s. Anyway, so you know, again, Sinatra was his rabbi, as we used to say in New York City politics. Except for a couple of times.
We have time for one more question, if there's one in the back.
I wasn't aware, but delighted to see what a mentor Jerry Lewis was, and to see the clip of Michael Jackson at the anniversary show. I was just wondering, with the found footage and the storage, were there any other instances of things that you previously didn't know about that you discovered?
Well, Sammy, I guess three things. Sammy kept scrapbooks. So a lot of that early stuff where you saw Will Maston Trio and Sammy Davis, those were all from his scrapbooks, which we were able to find. Second thing is, there were some people we interviewed who did not make it into the documentary, 2 of whom I really regret. Steve Laurence, who spoke beautifully about Sammy. They were really good friends. And it was Steve Laurence who first sang I've Gotta Be Me. And he said, I think it would be really interesting if a black person sang the song, and it should be Sammy. And Chita Rivera, who dated him briefly in the 1950s. And she told a story that they were dating and they were out at Sardi's, and they got into a big fight, and he took his eye out, and he put it on the table, and he said, is that what you want from me? Is that what you want from me? Which is a great line. We just couldn't fit it in anywhere. But to your point, as I'm sure you know, like if you collect scrapbooks or clippings or old newspapers and you use them too much, it sort of turns to a kind of brown confetti on the floor. So we literally spent, 36 hours straight photographing stuff and digitizing it in this storage units in Burbank. And we were cleaning up, and it looked like a ticker tape parade, practically. And there was a little card that we almost swept up, and we picked it up, and it said Ciro's on it on one side, a little folded over card. And it clearly was one of those kind of menu cards that they would have had in Ciro's in the 50s. And I turned it over, and in ballpoint pen it said, "Don't talk in such a highfalutin way. Don't give your props to your father and brother. It makes them look like stagehands. Be more whatever, blah, blah, blah." And it was Jerry Lewis's notes for Sammy from 1951 from Ciro's. And we were able to show that to Jerry when we interviewed him. So that was like a real, and you see some of it in the documentary. That was a magic, magic moment. And interviewing Jerry Lewis was astonishing. Jerry Lewis, it will come as no surprise to many of you, could be a bit of a jerk to some people. But he loved Sammy so much, he couldn't have been nicer to us and more generous and more wonderful. And I guess we interviewed him maybe 14 months before he died.
Well, it's a wonderful documentary. It'll be showing on PBS American Masters.
Yeah, February of 2019.
February, so spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you.
Laurence Maslon.